Have you ever poured your entire beautiful heart, your endless loyalty, and your deeply valuable time into someone who treats you like an entirely worthless, highly replaceable option, only to deeply realize that the more intensely you try to aggressively prove your massive worth, the more violently they actively disrespect you? We are falsely programmed to completely believe that extreme emotional closeness and constant, pathetic availability will eventually make toxic people suddenly realize our value and deeply love us. But the dark, terrifying psychological reality is that certain heavily narcissistic individuals are biologically wired to absolutely only respect the cold, suffocating punishment of your total distance. Before we dive into today's life-changing lesson on the incredibly dangerous, completely devastating psychological weapon of weaponized absence, please take a quick moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing you these powerful stories. In the deeply cutthroat, highly treacherous capital of a vast ancient empire, there lived an incredibly brilliant, fiercely loyal royal advisor named Cassius, who had completely dedicated his entire existence to protecting and desperately serving a deeply arrogant, highly manipulative emperor. Cassius was entirely available at every single hour of the day and freezing night, frantically rushing to aggressively solve the emperor's massive political crises, deeply sacrificing his own physical health, and desperately hoping that his flawless, unquestioning loyalty would eventually be warmly rewarded with basic human respect. But because Cassius was absolutely always there, constantly hovering like a desperate, highly submissive shadow, the emperor began to deeply despise his presence, routinely humiliating him in front of the wealthy nobles and aggressively treating his brilliant, life-saving advice as if it were the annoying, pathetic whispers of a worthless beggar. During a massive, highly dangerous border negotiation, Cassius brilliantly identified a deadly, hidden trap that would have completely destroyed the entire royal army. But the emperor violently slapped the heavy map out of his hands, loudly mocking his cautious brilliance and ordering him to silently stand in the dark corner like a completely obedient dog. Completely shattered, deeply humiliated, and physically sick from the massive, unappreciated weight of his own endless devotion, Cassius wandered deep into the freezing, misty mountains to seek the terrifying, unfiltered wisdom of an ancient, exiled shadow-tactician who had once ruthlessly ruled the entire continent. The old tactician sat perfectly still in the dark, freezing rain, his piercing, cold eyes locking on to the deeply broken young advisor before he growled with a heavy, utterly terrifying voice that seemed to violently shake the very wet stones beneath their freezing feet. "You are desperately offering a priceless, incredibly rare cup of pure water to a deeply arrogant man who is currently drowning in a massive ocean of your constant, pathetic availability, and you are foolishly crying because he violently slaps the heavy cup directly out of your incredibly desperate hands." The old master brutally explained that human psychology dictates that oxygen is the absolute most valuable, life-sustaining element in the entire universe, yet absolutely no one wakes up actively praising the invisible air they breathe because it is always completely, cheaply available for them to carelessly consume. But the exact, terrifying moment you brutally pinch an arrogant man's throat and entirely cut off his precious, heavily expected air supply, he will violently thrash, desperately panic, and aggressively realize that the completely invisible thing he entirely took for granted as the absolute only thing he desperately needs to actually survive. The master fiercely instructed Cassius to immediately return to the capital, pack his heavy bags in total absolute silence, and violently remove his highly premium, unappreciated presence from the emperor's massive palace without leaving a single, pathetic note of desperate emotional explanation. The very next morning, while the highly arrogant emperor was loudly barking his usual toxic orders and fully expecting his intensely loyal dog to aggressively come running, Cassius was already entirely gone, heavily riding a fast horse toward a distant, incredibly wealthy kingdom that actively valued brilliant, undeniable strategy. For the first few days, the arrogant emperor violently laughed, entirely convinced that the weak, deeply pathetic advisor would aggressively come crawling back, desperately begging for his highly toxic, completely conditional approval, just like he absolutely always did in the past. But as the cold, agonizing weeks turned into deeply terrifying months, the massive royal empire began to violently collapse under the heavy weight of its own chaotic incompetence, as the emperor quickly, painfully realized that Cassius had been secretly, brilliantly holding the entire broken kingdom together with his own two bare hands. Desperate, deeply humiliated, and entirely surrounded by highly incompetent, incredibly lazy nobles who only cared about their own massive wealth, the emperor sent dozens of frantic, heavily begging messengers, aggressively offering Cassius towering mountains of pure gold and ultimate, absolute power if he would simply return. But Cassius completely ignored the desperate, highly pathetic royal decrees, entirely refusing to ever return to a highly toxic, entirely broken table that only suddenly realized his massive, undeniable worth when they were violently starving to death in the cold dark. This dark, incredibly aggressive psychological story holds an absolutely urgent, deeply life-altering truth for anyone who is currently trapped in a highly toxic dynamic, desperately over-functioning for a deeply ungrateful partner, manipulative friend, or highly exploitative employer who treats you like absolute garbage. You must fundamentally understand that there is a deeply dark, incredibly ruthless percentage of the human population that completely lacks the basic emotional capacity to actively respect your warm, glowing presence, and they will only ever bow to the terrifying, freezing cold reality of your absolute absence. When you constantly heavily reward their deep, highly intentional disrespect by eagerly showing up the very next day with a warm, forgiving smile and a desperate, deeply submissive heart, you are actively training them to entirely view you as a highly pathetic, completely disposable object that possesses absolutely zero internal spine. The deeply terrifying, unavoidable psychological law of extreme scarcity strictly states that absolutely nothing on this highly competitive, chaotic earth is deeply valued or actively respected if it is constantly, incredibly cheaply available to whoever arrogantly demands it. The absolute highest, most devastating form of psychological dominance you can ever actively deploy against a deeply manipulative person is to completely, violently withdraw your highly premium, incredibly expensive energy without saying a single pathetic word of warning or deeply desperate closure. Do not fiercely write them a massive, deeply emotional paragraph desperately explaining exactly why you are finally leaving, because giving them a highly detailed, explosive explanation simply proves that you still heavily value their highly toxic, completely worthless opinion of your beautiful life. Instead, you must abruptly and completely disappear into the dark, misty shadows, aggressively creating a massive, suffocating psychological vacuum that violently forces them to intensely sit entirely alone in the terrifying, freezing reality of what their own toxic arrogance just permanently destroyed. They will desperately try to rapidly reach out, violently accusing you of being cruel, highly selfish, and incredibly arrogant. But you must strictly understand that their massive anger is simply the panicked, highly desperate reaction of a deeply toxic parasite that has just been brutally severed from its favorite, deeply reliable host. The exact moment you boldly decide to completely hold your absolute distance, completely refusing to eagerly break your heavy silence to desperately comfort their deeply fragile egos, is the exact moment you violently reclaim the massive, undeniable steering wheel of your own incredible, highly unstoppable destiny. You must eagerly learn to completely fall in love with the highly intimidating, absolutely liberating power of being entirely unreachable, totally unbothered, and entirely unavailable to people who have actively proven that they are completely blind to your massive, undeniable greatness. Stop desperately begging for a highly conditional, completely fake seat at a deeply toxic table filled with incredibly arrogant people, and forcefully build your own massive, beautiful castle in a distant, incredibly peaceful land where your raw, undeniable value is immediately recognized and deeply respected. Take a massive, incredibly deep breath today. Forcefully rip your highly expensive, heavily premium energy entirely away from the deeply ungrateful people who constantly drain it, and completely drop the heavy, exhausting burden of trying to violently force highly blind fools to actively see the bright light. Master the terrifying, completely invincible art of weaponized distance. Strictly refuse to ever violently negotiate your immense, unique worth with deeply manipulative people, and aggressively protect the sharp, beautiful boundaries of your own brilliant, highly protected mental peace. Do not ever desperately water down your incredibly powerful, highly potent absence by eagerly checking in on their pathetic lives just because your own deep, highly conditioned anxiety is completely terrified of the incredibly peaceful, beautifully silent void. When you finally completely stop caring if the deeply toxic crowd wildly understands your sudden departure, you violently open the heavy doors to a massive, beautifully bright future filled with the absolute, highly elevated respect of the very few people who actually truly matter. Reclaim your absolute power today. Completely ignore their desperate, pathetic screams for you to instantly return, and confidently walk directly into the massively successful, deeply peaceful reality that perfectly aligns with your own undeniable, heavy soul. Stay completely cold to their cheap, highly toxic manipulation. Stay incredibly focused on your own massive growth, and let your absolute, terrifying distance be the loudest, most devastating, absolutely undeniable statement you ever actually make. If you found true value in this dark, psychological lesson and learned something incredibly important about the true, devastating power of absolute distance today, please hit that like button. Leave a comment below about your own journey and subscribe to the channel for more powerful life lessons.